Hey, Rick. Welcome to Mass Construction Show.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks for making the ride down from New Hampshire. I think you are potentially the first New Hampshire guests. We had REARC. We had Johnny from REARC, who's out of Vermont. They do Vermont, New Hampshire. But I think you're the first representative from a company or municipality in New Hampshire, so this is exciting.
Awesome. Well, maybe it's a new start for you.
Yeah. Yes. So I asked you to come on. It kind of stemmed from, we had coffee 3 or 4 months ago, whatever it was, and maybe not even that long ago. And you and I feel like hit it off with respect to our outlook on kind of the problem with permitting and code enforcement in general, and kind of things that we were both seeing in the marketplace, and kind of felt like, we're doing this wrong. And I got that out of our conversation. I got that from posts I've seen you make on LinkedIn, and some of those posts on LinkedIn got me to, say, hey, we should sit down and talk. And I think we both have a similar kind of worldview when it comes to code enforcement and municipal government. So maybe just to set the stage for folks that are listening, how do you see the current marketplace when it comes to cities and towns, municipalities reviewing and issuing permits, performing inspections? What's kind of the norm?
Is there such a thing, Joe?
That's
right?
a good question.
So I mean,
maybe that's one of the big problems, the variability from one municipality to the next. That's a great point.
I think that is one of the drivers, right? I think what we end up seeing is that you have different size municipalities that have different size resources. And so typically in government, we build systems in a way that focus on making it easier for us in government. And we don't build systems through the lens of the end user a lot of times. And I think that's part of what we struggle with in the code community. We don't put on the glasses of someone else and say, well, why do they feel the way they do? What can we do to help make this process a little less painful so that we remove barriers, right? Because at the end of the day, some communities have a lot of barriers, whether that is fees, whether that is, just the timelines, whether that is their availability for inspections. And so I think what happens is based on the resources that we have, and kind of a misunderstanding, I think, on a lot of municipal leaders' perspective as to what is code enforcement and how do we do that. And I think those lead to the challenges that you're talking about, right? Is how do we keep people engaged in the process willingly? And I liken it kind of to, we have stoplights everywhere, and yet we can't put police officers on every corner to enforce stoplight regulations. So we rely on human beings in the general public to voluntarily follow those rules. And we know that doesn't work 100% of the time, but the goal is to try to get as close to 100% of them doing the right thing, whether we're there or not. And I think that's kind of the lens or the focal point that we in the what I'll call the code compliance world. I don't like to use the enforcement word, and I'll explain that as we go. But I think if we look through the lens of we need people to voluntarily comply, how do we get them to play? And we think about what are the things that prevent them or discourage them from playing. Because at some point, we're humans, right? We all make choices, just like I drove down here today, and I made a choice of what speed I was going to drive. Did I exactly follow what was posted? No. Right. Did I have a tolerance level? Yes, right? And so we're humans. And adults in particular don't like to be told what to do. They like to choose what to do. And I think if we think like that as code professionals, we'll actually get a greater level of partnership and success.
Yeah. So is it fair to say the current status of things, and start with, maybe I'll paraphrase what we were saying, which is like inconsistent application?
Yeah, I think it's inconsistent and it's disjointed.
Yeah, so applications and requirements from municipality to municipality, and in some cases within the same municipality, which is even, it sounds shocking to some people, but that just happens. Building official, building inspector A wants this, building inspector B wants this, depends who gets it, or who does your inspection, or who does your plan review, then that's what you get. So there's that inconsistency there. There is a efficiency. Takes a long time. And again, this isn't every community, but I would say the majority of communities, people feel like this takes too long to get a permit, or at least an answer. There is an inability to have a conversation up front. Now I understand the bigger communities, they say, listen, we can't talk to, 5,000 people a month before they come in for a permit. But I think there has to be some grace there for, okay, these are some bigger projects. Let's at least give some people insight into how we're going to view it, maybe have a conversation, help people plan better. And I think if I went on at the end of the day, it's that, you alluded to it earlier, like there's not a customer service or customer centric mentality. It's what works for us from a regulatory and government enforcement standpoint. And that's what we're going to do, because that's how we can control things. And there's no thought into what makes this a better experience for the constituent or the business owner, whatever, coming into the department. Is that a fair?
I think that's accurate. And as you know, I mean, I've traveled across the U.S. teaching inspectors in a variety of different formats. And the one thing that I think helps, if those people had operated a business, if they'd been in a project management role, mm-hmm. what I found is they tend to understand a little bit better, how do we meet the industry where the industry is? And I think from an inspectional standpoint, we could do a lot better service if we thought like that. So I'm kind of a pain in the neck. I tend to ask the question why ad nauseum. So when somebody says we do it this way, that's my first question. Well, why? What does that give us, right? What's the value add? If there's no value add, and it's kind of like a Six Sigma concept of asking, what are we doing and what's the value? And does it accomplish what we're trying to accomplish? And I think without stopping the wheels once in a while and doing that activity, I think you get into we've always done it this way. And if we think about construction today and construction 40 years ago, it's different. The materials are completely different. The way we do things are completely different. And yet, from an oversight perspective, sometimes I don't think we're there. We don't catch up.
Yeah, very little. I mean, I think even written codes struggle to keep up with technology, because technology moves much faster than code development. I don't want to say allows for, but code development can't keep up with the pace of change. They struggle to.
Well, that's true, but the codes are very forgiving, and I think a lot of times one of the challenges we have as an industry is we arrive. As an inspector, we get trained. We start to get a little bit comfortable by doing a few inspections with interacting with people, and some inspectors resort to because I said so, which is never a great reason. Yeah. But if you look at the code, every single code, fire, plumbing, building, electrical, mechanical, there's enough room in there for new technology. What I find is inspectors generally are reluctant to go down that road because it's uncomfortable. It's something they don't know, and people like to stick to what they know.
Yeah, I mean, Chapter 1, I don't know if it's a mass amendment or if it's straight from the IBC, but you have alternative means and methods, which gives the building official allowance to approve something. Yes, they need to see testing.
It's a process.
And things like that, but they have that, the code affords them that ability, and that's the flexibility you're talking about. But I think what happens is that reflexively, that code official doesn't want to take on any of the risk or responsibility of accepting that. So what do? They refuse it and say, go to the Board of Appeals and let the board.
That's
as a CYA.
It's a cop out.
It is a cop out.
It's a cop out.
Here's where I will push back and defend the people that do that, which is they say, okay, what's the win for me as the code official to stick my neck out? Something goes sideways, something goes wrong, and then they say, well, why did you allow this?
Are you sticking your neck out? That's the question, right? I think that's a misunderstanding on the part of code officials. We'll stick our neck out. In Massachusetts in particular, Chapter 1 explicitly requires testing data. It requires potentially additional reports. We have in Massachusetts the concept of construction control, which puts licensed design professionals who are in the industry. You have multiple industry professionals that are licensed in engineering and design basically presenting this to you. So as a code official in Massachusetts in particular with construction control, I would argue that's completely false. A lot of the liability is back on those engineering folks. The rule of thumb I always used, and I use today, right? If you want to bring something new, let's talk about it. And I think the conversation leads to what's the process for acceptance. So oftentimes, okay, that sounds logical to me. Here's what I need to do. I need a third party to evaluate that and review it, right? And the code allows that, right? Technical assistance. And so I think if we understand the mechanisms, right? The tools in the toolbox, that's what I think we have a challenge with. Sometimes people like to use certain tools. You can drive a nail with a crescent wrench. It's the wrong tool, but you can do it, right? And I think making sure that we have proficiency in accessing and understanding the tools we have in the code and in the inspectional world is the power that helps us be facilitators, not regulators, right? And I think that's one of the conversations I want to have today is this idea that our job, we need to ask, why are we here? You say, oh, well, we're here to enforce the code. Well, who wants the code? Why is there a code? So when you think about that, right, you get down to, right, our legislative folks who are our representatives have said that this is what we want for standards. Okay, that's great. The second angle to that gets forgotten quite often is what's the tolerance for enforcement, like strict enforcement of those standards. Right? And I'll give you an example. There are laws on the books in smoking. Underage. There are laws on the books in jurisdictions for riding bicycles without a bicycle helmet. I can't think of the last time I've seen a police cruiser with a 13-year-old in front of them with the blue lights going because of bicycle. Those laws are on the books, but there's discretionary enforcement, and rightfully so, because the public won't tolerate that level of strict enforcement. And I think the way we as code officials become stronger is by having an open mind. And I think all too often we get into a checklist mentality and we think it's an if-then statement and we become nothing more than administrative paper pushers. Yeah. And I think that when we do that, we essentially do a disservice to the industry as well as the public because we don't have enough flexibility for those new technologies. We don't have those new methods, right? How do we ever grow as an industry if we don't allow for something new? And I think that's the challenge, right? Is getting enough depth in both training and experience. And this industry is hard. When I started as a code official almost 40 years ago, I can tell you that my first exam in the fire code was in the old BOCA codes. And that book probably had about 130 pages, but they were half size. It wasn't the 8.5 by 11 we have today. And today we could stack the books and cover this table, and they could be 3 feet high between the codes and standards. Yes. and when you think about that, we're asking a lot of code officials.
Boy, there's too many things there that I want to follow up on. You are right. And I think Well, first off, I'll say, I'll continue to push back on you.
Good.
I share your worldview, but I want to push back where I can, because the people that are listening will say, oh, he's saying that, but what about this? So I want to say, well, what about the code official? Well, like, why should they stick out? They're like, so I want to continue to push back, not
Agreed.
because I'm disagreeing with you, but because I think it's important for people to hear the back and forth in the rebuttals. And I have a couple things to say. So that, I forget the phrase, what level of enforcement will be tolerated, right? I like that, right? And going back to your speeding analogy, if we had police officers everywhere around the town that were writing tickets for people that went 1 mile over the speed limit,
Correct.
the constituents would be up some politicians' asses real quick, and there would be bedlam, right?
Exactly.
In this show we swear on, by the way, if I didn't tell you that leading in. So, like, that's right. It wouldn't be it'd be like, what are you people doing, right? But that level, that correct level, how does that get taught, right? And I'm going to follow up. And that goes back to, when you talked about education, you're given a little bit of training and then you're on the way. I believe that is another thing that is currently wrong with the system or the process at municipalities. The training for code officials is not there, right? You clearly have been doing this a long time. When you teach, you learn codes better, right? And I actually was digging in. I was looking and I saw was reading like your resume more or less on LinkedIn. And then after all this stuff, I got down, it said in Nashua and it said 20 years. I'm like, how the fuck did he do 20 years in that? And I'm like, so you're a lot older than you look, right? And then I'm looking and it's like in 1985, like 1985, what was he doing in 1985? So you have the luxury of have been at this a long time. By the nature of teaching, you learn a lot more. But I mean, I would argue that there's probably a lot of building officials that don't know that piece is in chapter 1. So going back to education, how do we educate in a way to help people understand the codes? And some of that is it takes time. And then how do we educate the person for what's the right level of enforcement?
Honestly, I think part of the challenge we have is our education is focused on technical education only. And I honestly think that the strong code official is one who has great humility and the ability to pump the brakes, stop and think. So my inspectional approach often is literally walking into a space, looking up at something and scratching my head in silence, waiting for somebody to ask me a question.
Good.
I think sometimes we get into the perspective that we need to tell somebody we're the smartest person in the room. And I think that's a completely wrong approach. And it sets us up for some of the conflicts and some of the battles that we have. Because we again, as started out saying, adults don't like to be told what to do. I mean, if you're a parent or you've been a parent, you know that at a certain age, when you tell your kids something, it's almost an invitation to do exactly what you're telling them not to do.
Yes.
Right? And so you have to develop a stronger skill set and strategy on how you mentor your child to basically develop into the right human being. And I think the same thing is true for what we're doing as code officials. I think there's a lot of people out there. We spend a lot of time focused on who's right and wrong. I don't think of it like that, right? I think of it, did we achieve the purpose and intent? And if we go back to the purpose and intent of every single code, it is to provide, quote, reasonable levels of safety and health.
Yes.
And I think we sometimes get ourselves to think that every single item is a make or break. The war is won or lost on it.
Yeah.
And I think that we forget that all of these systems and all of these elements in the code are layered together so that there's multiple layers to achieve that reasonable level of safety. And until somebody can get that level of maturity in their thinking, it becomes an if-then statement, right? We start out inspectors, we train them, and oftentimes we hand them a checklist. And we say, go do an inspection. And guess what ends up happening? They only focus on the checklist.
Yeah.
I had a gentleman I hired to work for me when I was working for the university. Awesome human being. 20 plus years as a fire prevention person. He retired, hired him. And I said to him when he first started, I said, I want you to go over there and I want you to walk through the building and I want you to write me a list of things that you think we need to address. And he came back and he goes, okay, I did. And he had like 6 pages. And I went, well, okay, what do you got? And he said to me, he says, well, we get this because NFPA 1 says this, and over here NFPA 10 says this. And I said, I don't care about the codes. And he looked at me funny. And this is a gentleman who's been in the industry a while. He's bright. He understands how to interact with people. He's done the job for a long time. And I said, what I care about is the building safe? Would you want your wife to go in that building? Your grandchild? Right? Were there any trip and fall hazards? And he looked at me. I said, because you don't find a trip and fall hazard in the building code or the fire code. So if we could get ourselves adjusted in the way we think, instead of if-then logic, to more globalistic logic of, do we achieve the end results? I think we become stronger and we become more open-minded to those unique things. Existing buildings are where the rubber meets the road, right? The new buildings are easy. You got adjustments before you build the footings and foundations. You know what you need to carry, and if you need to carry something different, you can make those adjustments. It's easy. You have enough room for the egress. Your stairways can get the right geometry just because your ceiling
pretty much prescribed.
Right. So when you think of that, people go, "Oh, wow, those are difficult." They're easy. What's harder is when you're handed a box, and the box only has a finite dimension, and you have to try to make things fit. And I think that the existing building and enforcement, if you will, and like I said, I don't care for enforcement because the word force is in it. And I believe we get way further if we focus on compliance. And so when we talk about gaining compliance in existing buildings, I think it's really important for us to think about, it didn't become this way overnight. It's probably not going to become a gold nugget overnight. And that's a difficult position. When you talk about people feeling like they don't want to stick their neck out, that's where we get into our neck being stuck out a little. But if you understand where you're coming from and where you're headed to, right, and you understand a little bit about tort law, which is helpful, and I think a lot of code officials don't understand that. They think everything they're liable for. And
I'm guilty of that.
Yeah. And I think if they think more like, what is my duty versus what are my discretionary acts, right, then they can feel more comfortable. So I really think it's important to have those conversations in basic inspector training.
Yeah. So let's talk about, in my mind, I agree with you with respect to, if I'm going to print out an ideal candidate, I want someone with at least 5 years working in the business, having to be on the other side of the counter, trying to get a permit, needing to get an inspection to close up a wall while you have people stand in their way, understand the pains, right? And that also gets you to understand better what that level of enforcement is, right? Because you've been through it. You're like, nope, what's happening in the industry? What's realistic? You know what I mean? Do we need to do screw inspections on that? Where's the line here, right? So at a minimum 5 years experience on the other side, right? I think it's really tough twofold. One, to start off first job in code enforcement and your first job in government, right? Both of those are not the real world, right? And I think you need to start on both fronts, outside of government and working on the other side of the counter from the code official, so you understand what does it feel like when you have a code official who solely thinks about enforcement and, is there and not on my watch kind of attitude, and like, well, what does that do to that person? What's the ramifications on a homeowner when you want, well, get me an engineer's letter on that. Okay, well, that's $2,000 out of somebody's pocket. And if I was to say to you, Mrs. Building Inspector, to provide me a check for $2,000 right now, that would be a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah.
So we have to think very carefully before we're asking somebody to spend money. And, a lot of people will say that, well, they're a big company, they can afford it. It doesn't mean that they should spend that. Like, that shouldn't be the thing. Like, do they need that truly or not? If they do, then let's get that. But not because you have the idea of like, oh, I'm going to cover my ass and I'm going to get a letter on everything, right? Like, yeah. So I think having been on that side really needs to be a prerequisite to have had those feelings, had that experience. I think that's huge. Then the other piece, when it comes to the checklist person versus someone who's looking at it more kind of holistically, part of that, and now we're building the perfect inspector. To me, I think a personality test comes into this, right? There are certain people, if you are a very linear person, you're probably not the right person to go out and use discretion, right? And we need people like that. I need someone working for me like that because I am not good at that. I am not linear. I'm not black and white. I don't make lists for things. My life is a little bit of fucking chaos, right? But I can kind of just, like...
You've seen my desk, Joe?
Yeah, right? So that ability to be flexible is really important. Some people, that's not their strong suit. So in my mind, we're crafting this person. It's that person with the experience, with the right personality. And then at that point, you can teach them the code.
You just hit on a really important point. I'm in the process right now of hiring a fire inspector. And we did interviews this week. And the interesting thing is the interviews, questions that we asked had nothing to do with the technical aspects of the code. And the reason for that is exactly what you're saying. I need to understand how somebody's going to think and how they're going to act. And I think we have a challenge right now with people that want to be in these positions anyway, right?
Yeah.
Just like law enforcement, just like public safety right now is not a field
we got to dig into
people
this.
want to jump into. But when we think about what it is that makes a good inspector, and this brings me back, my daughter is a civil engineer, and when her former boyfriend, who was also a civil engineer, very interested in design, when they get out of school, I said to him, my suggestion to you is go work as an assistant super on a major construction project. Do that for a minimum of a year. And he's going, but I want to be in design. I go, I know you do. But here's the problem. You will set yourself apart from the other civil engineers doing this work because you'll understand constructability. You won't just understand calculations and pretty lines on paper. My brother's a master electrician, and one time he said to me, he goes, yeah, engineers draw pretty pictures and we actually make it work. And I don't mean that as a slight, but that stuck with me because what he was trying to say is sometimes drawing something out conceptually and then proving out maybe the technical aspects of it, it's not going to work in the physical box that you're in. And I think that's what you're saying, I think, is the same thing, right? Is that having some experience base on which to draw gives you the ability to have, as I mentioned, being humble. Probably the number one trait that we need an inspector is to be humble. I have been in a very different place as a human, as an inspector. I've been in a very different place where I wasn't very humble. I've been more strong-willed. And what I figured out over the years was I don't have to prove to anybody that I'm right or smart, just myself. And so when we spend all our time, spouting off a code citation or saying the code says, well, why does it say? Right? I find if we position ourselves better to understand why does that provision exist, what's it trying to accomplish, then when we're on the margins in these existing building places in particular, we can kind of make a true value judgment about, are we accomplishing what it's trying to accomplish? And I think that when you talk about the number of years of experience, for example, I agree in concept. I think the challenge we have is, and I've worked in public sector a long time. The challenge we have is we could have somebody with 40 years experience, and really what it is 1 year experience 40 different times. And there's a difference. And so I think what we really need to focus on is vetting people based on what we need. And like you said, we can teach technical things. If you have learning capacity and a will and an open-mindedness, and that's a personality issue, right? And so a code inspector, in my opinion, if I'm looking for an entry-level inspector and that's all I really ever want out of them, I don't need them to grow into being the code official, then I might be okay with somebody who is, let's say, a little bit obsessive compulsive that likes the lists and the structure. But that person's not going to do well in that higher level role, right? And so I think it is important to understand, what are we hiring for? What are the skill sets we really need? And so from my perspective, having somebody who's able to sit down and have a conversation, not feel intimidated, and that comes with practice. In my role currently, one of the things that I'm striving to do is to provide opportunities for my staff to be out front. I don't need to be the one speaking. I don't want to be the one speaking. I want to build their opportunities so that we now have a much stronger, more cohesive ability, regardless of who they're speaking to, right? The person who comes into the counter asking a question is there because they have a question. If they knew the answer, they wouldn't be at the counter. You know, and we were talking a little bit about tolerance earlier, and I'm a soccer official, so I've been an athletics official in various sports for a long time. One of the things in soccer as an official, what you're trying to do is not inject yourself and interfere with the game. And the same is true in this construction world. You have to make a judgment as to, is the quote foul trivial? And if it's trivial, right, then play on. And I think the same mentality is true in this business. If we could get people to understand and identify the trivial or the inconsequential, and I think a lot of times from my perspective, that's what we're doing, is we get locked in on the trivial because we don't have the depth to understand the consequential in a way that we feel good about, but we can manage. You're supposed to have a permit, and you're supposed to have done this, and you're supposed to have done that, and we get all focused on the administrative aspects of our role, which is important. But when we do that, that's where we put 80% of our energy, and that's where 80% of our conflicts come. The conflicts that most inspectors have nothing to do with the technical nature. They mostly have to do with the administrative processes. And then we have people oftentimes that get hung up on feeling like it's our job to correct behavior via punishment, right? And I think that's another philosophy change that I think we need to do as inspectors. Our job isn't to punish anybody. It's to help facilitate getting, if it's a building project, getting it going on the right foot, continuing on the right foot, and completing on the right foot. And if we thought of ourselves as in the bigger picture of why is there even code enforcement? 60 years ago, we didn't have building inspectors, right? In most jurisdictions, people just did what they wanted. So when you go back and ask, what are you trying to do? Really, what are we trying to do? We're really there for the community. We're there in some respects to help the citizenry and the property owners who don't have the technical expertise to validate whether or not the contract is doing what they're supposed to be doing. But we're also there because our communities rely on our buildings and the places that we live and play having certain standards. And they rely on those for a host of reasons, mostly because we tax property, right? And so our viability as a community and the ability for us to attract industry and have jobs so that people have places to work is really about how well our community's maintained.
Yeah, and I would say also a level of protection for neighbors or the public that are going to go into that building, right? There's a certain assumed level of safety when something is built now, right? If they were in a vacuum, okay, you build a horrible building and it collapses on yourself, and okay, you killed yourself. Too bad, right? But when you say we're here for the community, okay, well, there's a level of no, because if your building catches on fire and you catch mine on fire, now we have a problem, right? And so
exactly. So when we get into things like zoning, right, we look at those aspects. Impact of what we're doing on something around us and our surroundings. And I think that's that level of kind of macro look at what we're doing helps an inspector gain perspective on where we're at and what we're really trying to accomplish. And when you have that in the back of your mind, it's much easier to come to the table, have conversation. You know, the other thing is understanding why somebody's in front of you. And I've had people have disdain for contractors that they were working with, you know, and I made the comment, why? Well, all they care about is money. And I'm like, well, they're in business. They're in business to make money. And they're in business to make money so that they can grow their business and that they can employ more people and that they can feed more families. And so when you think about what somebody's perspective is, I had a situation recently, you know, and the person's asking questions, and it brought me back to when I as a fire marshal in Nashua, and I did an interview with a reporter, and he asked me a question, and I looked at him, and I said, Andy, you know I can't answer that. He goes, I know you can't, Rick. He goes, but you know I had to ask.
Huh.
And it goes to what you were saying about pushing back, right? It's making sure you ask the questions. And I think that the same is true. If we're not able to understand someone else where they're coming from, then it makes us feel like it's personal. And once we feel personally involved from an emotion perspective, we lose perspective.
yeah, it's a bad recipe. Now, some people, I joke whenever a reporter, some people say right, they're trying to say I think, but legitimately, I'm sure there are other folks in the industry and other inspectors are going to say, when you're talking about, you know, educating people and working with people in our roles to help facilitate things and all that other stuff, they'll say, okay, yeah, that's great, and that seems very Pollyanna. What about the bad actors?
Okay, what about them?
Don't you need to be the enforcer when it comes to bad actors? Like,
well, let's split the baby a little bit.
Yep.
Let's talk about construction versus operations and maintenance, right? So because there's a difference there. Mm-hmm. In construction, we separate the bad actors very simply. Because if you're talented at what you're doing and you're making sure that they're following the minimum standards, I don't care what their personality is. I've had doctors that I couldn't stand as a person, but they were the most experienced people for the issue that was at hand. And so I tolerated their gruffness because I needed their brain and their skill set. And I think if we think like that, I don't really care what your personality is. I'm going to treat you the same. I've taken people to court on code violations, including some folks that were sitting politicians. And I've always believed, I walk in, I shake their hand, it's not personal. It is a business move. And I think the more we can focus on the business aspect and the goal of the business aspect, right? That's it. Don't focus on whether or not you like the person. You don't have to like them. You need to focus on what is the end goal. And the end goal in our world is compliance. And if we could just get our head around, focus on the compliance angle and what is compliance, right? And the codes are not black and white. They are not if-then statements. If they were, we would not need code officials, right? All we need is a checklist for somebody to fill out.
Yeah. But I don't mean necessarily people with bad attitudes and jerks. I mean the people that create apartments that, without permits, and there's no smoke detectors in there, and they're putting people's lives at risk, or like bad actors in that sense, or people that are not pulling permits. And I don't know, like there's a level of enforcement with that too, right? But the people who are intentionally doing things that can harm the community.
So
Right.
so let's thanks for the segue, by the way. This is a good shift. The first thing we have to do is ask why they're not. What have we created for barriers that force them to make choices, right?
I'm smiling because the amount of people that
Because we don't think like this,
I agree.
right? So if I'm
back to why,
if I'm a business owner, right, and it's going to take me, and let's just put it in dollars and cents because people understand dollars and cents. If I've got to spend $100,000 in process and paperwork, and time is money, folks. So if it's going to take me 6 months to go through your process just because so I can get a ticket punch from daddy, I'm not doing it. I'm going to roll the dice. So maybe if we looked at our processes a little more, a great example, let's talk the roofing industry. Right?
By the way, there's code officials that are listening and their heads are exploding right
I know
now.
they are. I know they are. I'd sit in the exact same room with them and have the same conversation. I know. That's part of it, right? We need to get better at accepting diverse views.
I agree.
And if we could, as code officials, right, if we could think about the diversity of our community, and they have diverse views, why would we expect that somebody's going to share exactly the same perspective?
Look.
So from my perspective, I think about this and I say, well, what are we doing? The roofing industry, right? Right now, if you're a homeowner and you have somebody come do your roof, which requires a permit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Supposed to. Wink, wink, nod, nod, right? People, they didn't get a permit. Well, let's just work through this. The industry model, the way roofers are able to make the margin work from a business perspective is because they have the crew that shows up. Excuse me. They have the crew that shows up at sunup. They strip the roof. They make the repairs.
Have it watertight by the end of the day.
And they have it watertight or in most cases complete by sundown. Now let's think about our process and our demands as, again, regulators instead of facilitators. Well, we'll be there between 10 and noon. Now, if I'm a roofing contractor, am I going to sit 8 to 10 people on the ground waiting for 2 hours? Am I going to risk having the rain that's coming 3 hours from now? There's a lot of variables that plug into these successful projects. So roofing's a great example of we need to meet the industry where they're at instead of forcing them into our little playpen, right? If the goal is making sure that that homeowner or that business is getting what they paid for and that it's meeting the minimum standards, then there's a million ways we could do that. If I said, Joe, I want to drive to Washington, D.C., and Joe said, well, you can only take I-95, and the bridge has been destroyed by the big cargo ship that ran into it, how do I get to Washington, D.C.? Right? So the point is there's a million different ways to do things. Mm-hmm. And we get so pigeonholed into it must be a certain way that we forget that maybe if we changed how we did things, and I'll give you an example. One of the things we're doing right now in Keene, I've challenged the staff to think about this very issue. So we've tailored our process differently, right? We've worked with the contractors. We've thought about the idea of how does roofing work? We had a very low participation rate in permitting for roofing, right? And we've increased that dramatically. And the question is why? Because we're no longer a barrier, right? So the barrier isn't necessarily the small permit fee for a roof job. It isn't necessarily if we have online access to applying for permits. The barrier typically is on the inspection side, because we can't sit the contractors and the workers for 8 hours or 2 hours or 3 hours while we get our inspector that does just residential to show up there. And so what we've done is gone to think through the process of roofing, think through what steps of documentation we might need. And we've had, we've discussed and trying to put together a process that says, okay, how can you capture as the roofer, as you go, certain documentation, and then we can do a final inspection and validate some of that material. Now, once the roof cover's on, it's hard for you to see certain things. Well, with all the technology we have today, I mean, during COVID, we had video inspections going on. Why can't we use some of those same thought processes? An electrician that wants to put in a single receptacle, technically that requires a permit, right? I have a licensed trade person that has a license, that has license oversight. So if they're not doing things the way they're supposed to be, and we've got it so locked down that they need to pull a permit, come in, sign for the permit, pick the permit up, go do the job. If we're not available, I mean, that receptacle might take an hour start to finish. Now they got to sit around and wait. If that person's value from a dollars and cents perspective as a business is $400 an hour, right? And people say, "Oh, that's not." Actually, when we start talking about what we're talking about, if they pays $100 an hour, their value is $400 to $500 easy. If we start thinking about that, nobody's going to throw away $1,500 when they could do it, put $300 and walk away. And if you catch me, what's the worst that's going to happen? And that's reality. And if we start understanding that as code officials, and instead of getting our undies in a bunch, we focused on the idea of how do we change that? How do we get greater participation? And I would submit that I think we get greater participation by not being so rigid in our thinking, not being so rigid in our processes, understanding what's a must in our process versus what's nice to have, and being flexible enough to say that every single time it doesn't have to be this before that.
Yeah. Do you run into some state law issues though?
No.
If from a state perspective, something is required, then you as a town need to, or you as a municipality need to.
So So what's the requirement? Right. So the requirement is that a building permit, right? And I'm in New Hampshire now, so I'll talk a little bit differently. But in New Hampshire, right, the community needs to either do one of two things. They have to legislatively enact a building official, right? If they don't do that, then that defaults by state law to the state fire marshal, who has building inspectors. So in the less incorporated or the less populated places, if you build, you still have a permit requirement, and you just go to a different AHJ. So when we think about, a municipality's role, once they adopt an AHJ, then they're on the hook to do certain things, and that is inspect, issue permits, issue certificates of occupancy, right? Well, it doesn't say exactly how I have to inspect, right? In the IBC, it talks about different inspection criteria. IRC's got a little bit different, but same concept, right? Does it say I have to inspect those independently? Does it say I can accept third-party reports for inspections?
Yeah.
Aren't we doing that? If we're creating a structure so that we can still get the documentation, and then we're doing a final, let's talk single-family home, asphalt roof. It's not that hard to validate. Do we have drip edge? Do we have ice and water shield? Right? Can we get some photographic evidence of that? Right? Maybe can we get some self-certification? I mean, at the end of a job in Massachusetts, even you have to sign a statement that say that basically you're complete the job, right? Especially in construction control jobs.
Yep.
Right? So you have to submit that to the construction control folks, so they'll do their piece. It's the same mentality. We're just looking at different ways. Can we use some technical assistance? Do I go out and a great example? I don't test concrete.
Yeah.
I have somebody else do that.
Yeah.
Do I get a
Chapter
report?
17 allows for it. Yep.
But Chapter 17 in technical assistance in Chapter 1 allows for us to do that with anything if we choose. And I think that's kind of the mentality is we always feel like we have to. It's got to pass my standards. It's really not about me. right? And I think there's not a code official out there or a contractor out there who loves everything in that code book, right? I don't like a lot of the code book. I've argued against it when it's been in the adoption process, but it's in there. And so we have to deal with it. And I think that that's the kind of process to think about is we don't have to deal with it because we like it. We have to deal with it because one code section has probably 15 to 30 other provisions that rely on it being whole, right? And the best example I can give you is when we talk about ratings, we talk about separations, right? If we don't have the separations done correctly, then the rest of the scheme, the egress travel distance scheme, the fire growth and development, it all falls apart. And so I think that's what we need to kind of think about is where are those critical junctures? Great example, new building. What's the most critical part of the new building? I mean, you've been in this industry a long time.
Yeah, probably fire separation, structural components.
Okay, structural, there we go. If I come out of the ground wrong, I'm done. So if I don't spend a lot of time as a contractor and a code official making sure my footings, foundations, compaction, all of that stuff is correct, I've thrown the entire assumption base off. And I think that that's what we need to do as code officials is really focus and drill down on what are those critical junctures in a project, whether it's an existing building or a new building, and put our resources there. We'll never have enough resources to do everything. So the question is how do we create our systems so that we create partnership? Because I can tell you over my tenure, as a code official, relationships are where we win. I know which folks that I can have some reasonable reliance on. Do I spot check them? Sure I do. Right? Part of that is being present. I went and did an inspection one time. I walked in the door, I looked up, and I pointed to something, and I asked the question of the contractor, and he said, I was wondering if you're going to catch that. And as a code official, I was like blown away. And I just said to him, I says, you know what? I says, I'm not going to waste my time today. Here's what you need to do. Anything you were wondering if I was going to catch, you go fix it. And once you call, we'll schedule a new inspection time. And oh, by the way, it's going to take 3 to 4 times what it would have taken now. Well, I'll come because I can't have any trust in what you tell me or show me. I have to see it for myself, right? And so the way we're able to make headway in our jobs as code officials is to develop relationships, trust but verify, and understand we can't be at every place at every moment. We post speed limit signs. We hope people go the speed limit. We can't have a cop running radar on every street in every community, right? We have to rely on some voluntary compliance. I would submit that, in my opinion, the level of voluntary compliance is directly proportional to your ability to create relationships.
Yeah, relationships and ease of use.
And common understanding.
Because think about it this way, like marketers and businesses have figured out reducing friction in the process gets so much more conversion, right? If you have to click on 2 things to buy something, you lose 90% of the people. You get it down to 1 click, 90% of the people are doing it, right? So like, that's where you're going to get the most compliance. If it's easy to get a permit, I'll just get a permit for everything and cover my ass, right? Because people want a permit because they want to protect themselves in a lot of cases, right? They don't want to have something go wrong and then they turn around, well, oh, you're the contractor that was working without a permit and you did this wrong. Like, I'd always rather just have a permit. But to your point, if it's going to cost me $100,000 and I'm going to lose, 4 months and I'm going to bang my head off, well, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to roll the dice then, right?
Exactly. And I great example, right? Construction control. In the code Massachusetts, the code official has some discretion on construction control for minor things, right? It's right there. Gives you the discretion. So if I get somebody that's literally taking a non-structural wall, a petition, and putting a fixed glass panel in it, And I'm going to tell you as the code official that, as the owner from the code official perspective, that you need to hire a design professional to have construction control on putting a 4x8 sheet of glass in a non-structural wall, then what have I just done?
Yeah, you wouldn't need that technically you don't need
that's
the code. You don't need that though. They would be asking above and beyond.
That's reality.
Yeah.
No, actually the code's pretty broad. 3,500 cubic foot building requires construction control. Then there's the exceptions that the building official has some discretion on. So it starts out with a presumption of construction control. And so that's the problem, right, Joe? So here we have a great situation, a very minor level of work, right? If you ask yourself, what's the purpose of that petition, right? It's convenience more than anything. It's not rated. It's not required to be rated, right? So instead of putting something that's opaque that I can't see through, I'm putting something that's transparent that I can. What difference does that make? But if you are locked in on the process of administrative stuff and you're going to carry everything, remember the trifling foul comment? If you're going to carry everything to the letter of the law, and as you said, I've got to cover my ass because I'm worried about liability. It's a fictitious kind of self-aggrandizing prophecy. Mm-hmm. We have the power to do that as a code official, but what we've done is we've now created a barrier to conversation. I would much prefer as a code official to talk with you when you're thinking about something, right? And let's face it, if I've done that, had that kind of interaction with you and done that to you, what's the probability you're going to come to me and ask me a question?
Pretty high. Yeah.
You're not going to talk to me.
Oh, you're saying if I hold you to construction control on a piece of glass?
If I'm going to be that kind of overbearing and over the top, you're going to play outside of the box because you have to. Because you can't, just from a time perspective, now just think about the amount of time. That delayed that project months.
Oh, that's a real scenario.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Right? So when you think about what we do as code officials, we need to be thinking about
probably doubled the cost. Sorry for interrupting.
Who do we serve?
Yeah.
That's the question. Who do we serve? What are we here for? Right? If we get ourselves into the mindset that we are here for them, not the other way around, I think we have a lot of regulatory folks that think that we're here for them, not that they're here for us. Right? And I look at my role, and I have for a very long time as a code official, I'm here to help.
Will you explain a little more when you're saying regulatory folks that think we're here?
Sure.
Meaning that...
Have you ever stood in the line at the DMV, the RMV?
Yep.
Is that process geared to you, the consumer?
No.
Is it one of the most frustrating processes that you've ever been through?
Yes.
So ask yourself, it's been that way for decades. Mm-hmm. How come? Who are we here for? Right? I'm not putting them down. I'm just saying in government, we tend to do this. Mm-hmm. You could make the same argument for other services. What I'm suggesting is that if we took and looked outside the box about what is our purpose? Yes, we are here to help make sure that people do things to a minimum standard. Right? You can be right and wrong at the same time. And I think if people could understand that I could be correct technically, and my execution could be so far astray that I basically have created myself as the issue, then I'm wrong. Doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, if I've executed in a way that is intolerable, it doesn't matter that my intentions were pure.
Okay. Yeah, I was misunderstanding what you're saying. How do we then, these are all great concepts and approaches and absolutely the right style. How do we get municipalities to start thinking this way and operating this way? Because that's the goal of us even having this conversation is, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit, but Keene, New Hampshire is actually making steps to do exactly what you're saying, right?
We're absolutely trying, Joe.
And how do we, so for people say that that's not possible, no, it is possible. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's a big part of this, which is what excites me, which is, I'll tell you the big one was the fact that Keene gives you the option to have the town review your plans or for you to hire an outside third party to do the review. But if you choose the outside party, they will give you a what percent discount? 40% discount on your permit fee if you choose to go to the outside. So you can actually save money and maybe get your permit faster. Like, I tell that to people and they're like, what? Like, how? What? In most municipalities, you have to go pay for somebody else, and then you still have to pay the full permit fee. Right?
So I'll give you an example. If you're a homeowner and you have an architect design your addition, we give you a discount.
Because you don't need one under the IRC.
Because you don't need one. And the reality is now I have somebody who's a design professional, so our outlay of time is going to be less.
Yeah. So
right.
Yeah, I wanted to interject that, and we're gonna get to Keene in the end. I think this is, but I wanted to just almost throw a teaser out there for people to understand that in being kind of like a way to front run the conversation we're going to have right now on how do we actually get towns to do this. I want to white table clear and say, like, it's possible. Right? This is a reality. It's going to sound like that's impossible. No one's going to change. We've always done it this way. The state code. No, it can happen. Right? But what are some of the things that you're not claiming to have all the answers here? But and there's so many factors, right? We're talking about human factors, which are very challenging. But like, what are some of the ways we can get municipalities to start thinking this way? What are maybe some first kind of steps? What are some things like that you'd recommend?
I think one of the challenges we have, and it doesn't matter what it is, right? Whether or not it's having multiple fire stations, right, so that you achieve your response time, or whether or not it's sprinklers, right? We could get into the residential sprinkler conversation and throw the whole world upside down right now, but there's an argument to be had that residential sprinklers are actually green, because the data shows us that if you have a fire in a residential sprinkler location versus a non, you use 90% less water. So if you're in a jurisdiction that has a water challenge, there might be some value. If you're in a jurisdiction who's got a volunteer fire department, there might be some value. Mm-hmm. So you could have built-in features that actually play into real, true cost items and growth of government items that matter, right? And so, but you have to be willing to think of the intersectionality of all of these things, to use an in vogue term today. Mm-hmm. How do these things intersect? Where are they? How do they interplay? Mm-hmm. We like to put things in a box and only talk about things from our perspective. And when I think about how do we make the changes you asked earlier, first and foremost, we have to spend a lot more time focused on people. If we could just think of the way we approach everything from a person perspective, not an organization perspective, we'd start the change. Because generally speaking, I would venture to guess 80 to 90% of people just want to do the right thing. They don't know what the right thing is. They just need you to help them. And if we in the governmental sector came across as our only purpose here is to try to help you, right? Now get that, right? The 6 famous words, I'm from the government, I'm here to help.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'd like to make that a reality. I want people to be able to reach out, right? We focus on some of the, what I'll call the force things, right? How do we enforce? Somebody told us they poured a slab in their single family home without a permit. I kind of roll my eyes. I know they're supposed to get a permit, Joe, but I kind of like, okay, that's not the biggest transgression in the world. You know what I'm saying? So when I think about, well, why did they do, I spend a lot of time thinking about, why did somebody do something? How did we impact that decision, right? And years ago, I used to run a juvenile fire intervention program for youth that misused fire. And we used to do a program. One of the training sessions was on internal and external influences to decision making. And you think about that, right? How do we make decisions? If we ask ourselves those questions, it will help us understand why somebody's doing something. So, have you ever walked in and seen somebody dressed a certain way, or seen their personal adornments, and your eyes kind of go, whoa, because they're not what you would choose. I challenge you to sometimes think about, well, why did they do that? Why did they choose that? When we start to understand what influences our decisions, then we as service providers can do a better job at kind of getting out in front. And I think that's what we need to, it's work. It's hard work, right? It's hard work to constantly be evaluating the relationship or the conversation. Constantly. I prefer to ask. A lot of inspectors, a lot of people in my world are so afraid to just come right out and be direct. What are you trying to accomplish? Right? Let's just throw it on the table. I'm not holding anything. And if we would just do that, instead of kind of the dance that happens quite often, we'd waste less time, we'd become less frustrated, and we have a greater understanding, and we would be seen more as partners. And I think that's where I want our group to be up in Keene. I want us to be seen as an organization that when somebody needs something or somebody thinks of a scenario, they think, well, maybe Keene's dealt with that. Let's call them and see. Or, you know what, I don't know the answer, but I know if I call, they'll help point me in the right direction, right? Who do I call? We want them to know. Call us. We'll point you in the right direction. Simple thing. How do you change? You listen to your clients. And if you think of these people as clients, it will help because it puts a business context to it. Take the personalities out of it. I don't care if it's the most abrasive individual that I've dealt with or the person that I think is the sweetest person on the face of the earth. I'm going to treat them the same way. We're going to work with you, right? When I leave, I don't have to like you. I'm not going to dinner with you, but I have to provide you the same level of dignity and respect regardless of whether or not you provide it to me, unfortunately. Right? And I think if we think that way, we can avoid an awful lot of problems for ourselves. We can be seen as an organization that truly is here to service the community. We are public service, public safety people. And if we could not let that stray from our brain, that our entire purpose is to service the public. If you were I asked somebody once, I said, so what do you deserve for a tip? And they went, what are you talking about? I go, you go out to dinner and, you tip the waitress, the server? Well, yeah. Well, how come? What size tip do you give them? Well, it depends. Depends on what kind of service I get. Oh, so what would you deserve for a tip? Right? We're service providers. And if we would start thinking like service providers and think about, do you think every server that's in a restaurant is having an awesome day? But if they show up to your table with a smile and they're responsive to your needs, then you feel like you had great service. You have a great experience. If we would just put ourselves in that same mindset at the counter in a building, community development, fire, plumbing, I don't care where it is, regulatory environment, we would be so much better off. And we would stop banging our head against the walls as much as we do. Because people, we spend, if somebody doesn't play in our world and we have to go through a true enforcement action to hold them accountable to play in our world, I'm going to expend 900, 1,000% more time and energy on that one individual than I needed to. So if I invest the upfront time to provide the service, to ask the questions of what are they trying to achieve, right? I've asked people, what's your budget? And they look at you funny. I'm like, I don't need to know the dollars and cents, but are we talking about you've got a really small tolerance, right? What's your margin? If you don't have a big margin, then we can't talk about, futuristic type things. As a code official, we say, well, we can't design it for you. That's right, we can't. But we can help you understand the options. And I think that's where our value is in the upfront world. Right now in Keene, we have people calling and saying, "Hey, we're considering purchasing a building. We're considering doing X. We're wondering if this is going to come into play." And my answer is, well, do we have access to the building? Can we just meet you on site? People are like, well, yeah. You do that? Well, sure. So we take two people, spend a half an hour to an hour. So we've wasted 2 hours of personnel time. If you think that's a waste, I don't. Mm-hmm. And we just took and changed the dynamic of how we're viewed. And when the project gets to us, we've been so engaged from the beginning that it shortens the timelines. It takes everything and compresses it, and the customer walks away feeling like we had a very efficient and helpful process. Do they get everything they want? No. We still follow all the rules, but they know up front. I think the problem we forget in our end of the business is that it's the uncertainty. The uncertainty drives people to make decisions not to do certain things. And, down here in Mass, one of the uncertainties is, how do I keep myself below the 30% threshold so I don't have to do a complete accessibility upgrade is a good example. That uncertainty drives a lot of strategy. And if you think, it's actually a barrier to improving your building in many cases.
Oh, absolutely.
And so you think about barriers and you think about uncertainties and you ask, why does an owner choose not to do something? And people go, oh, they don't maintain their building. Well, we put so many things in that make it so they have to do a dance so they don't hit the tripwire because there's no way they can afford it. And I said to somebody, think about it this way. You buy a house, right? You know the house needs work. It's your first house. You know it's a fixer-upper, and you know it's going to take $50,000. You can do it over 5 years. You decide, I'm going to start with X. Pick it. I don't care if it's the bathroom or the kitchen. You pick it. So I go to start with X, and you walk into the code official, and they go, well, you need to upgrade the whole plumbing system in order to connect the new sink. Or you need to put a new electrical system in. Now I went from doing a kitchen project that I can manage, knowing that after 5 years, I'm going to have all of this stuff done, to now I can't do any project. And I think if we start thinking about it is better for people to do incremental improvements along the way than it is to not do any, right? And so we create that barrier, and we create that kind of hands-off, and that also pushes people out of the permitting world and into the roll the dice world.
Yeah, so one of two things, right? Either they don't do it, so they don't, or they do it without a permit. We're getting further from what we're hoping to accomplish.
Correct.
Right? How do we physically get, or in it's the right word here, how do we practically get municipalities to implement this way of thinking? Like, I have ideas in my mind, but does it have to start at the top? Does it?
Well, I think part of it is, and I'm in a unique role right now because the city was looking to add consistency. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the interesting things about my current role and the structure of my current role is that I oversee both building, fire, housing property standards, and health inspections. Mm-hmm. So the inspectional services for the whole city and the culture of that inspectional services essentially becomes one, right? And so I think what happens often in municipalities, and I think it's a lot due to our budgetary process, right? We're all clawing for our piece of the pie. And so we create fiefdoms, we create silos, and there's a disincentive to create transparent pass-through between the silos because you risk losing funding to that other, or control to that other entity. And I think a lot of people feel like the ownership piece. I think it takes strong leadership is the most important thing, to kind of continuously have the same philosophy reinforced, right? If you're going to have, right now, I think, what did I get, 5, 6, 8 8 people that are working for me doing inspections. They're all different personalities. They're all skilled. They're good people, right? They are completely at opposite ends of the field sometimes. And as a manager and a leader, I think one of the things that's incumbent upon me is to give them opportunities to try things, right? If we are so afraid of failure or mistakes, then we become paralyzed and we never grow. And so what I've tried to do is instill an opportunity for people to let's have a conversation, and then you carry it out with your own personality, with your own way of doing things, but providing that support mechanism. What happens a lot in code worlds is many code departments, it's a one-person show. And so there's not a lot of opportunity to have collaborative experience. You might have one other person that you call once in a while, but you don't sit at break time over a coffee and constantly have a conversation about some aspect of what you're doing so you can hear other people. And when we get into an echo chamber of our own voice, we don't ever change our way of thinking. And so I think that's one of the things, Joe, is just understanding the client's perspective, and then the leadership of the municipality needs to inject that. The problem is that most of the time, the governmental leaders, not the code folks, the governmental leaders have a complete misunderstanding of what it is we do.
Yeah, I think they have a misunderstanding of what we do, as well as, let's be frank, there's a control mechanism that politicians like. And if it's all open and transparent, then you don't need to call your city councilor or the mayor or whatever to help you get your thing through, because it's transparent, you can get it through. But if you do have to call your city councilor, well, that's a city council that you probably need to make a donation to. So you're there is a reality is there is a component of this is control that people in government to some degree may like. And from my perspective, I think there's a lot of things going on. And I think the way to do it is to, yes, you need the political will. And like you said, you need strong leadership, right? But keep in mind that leadership, they're politicians. New politicians get elected. And then, so I think it has to come from the leaders within the government, but it also has to come from building officials.
Yeah, I agree.
And fire officials. Like they need to, I say we, but it's not me anymore. I mean, sometimes I'm third party, right? So, and like this morning I did a footing inspection as a building official, right? So, yeah, still kind of me as well. So, but we need to look at it and say, how do we make this better? And even if you don't agree with it from the moral or the ethical kind of perspective that we're looking at it, of like, what's the greater good here? What's the right thing to do? Even if you don't want to look at it that way and you want to be calculated, in the rundown, which is a separate little Instagram Live podcast that we do, we look and we're watching and we're constantly talking about articles where different states are privatizing departments, more third-party reviews. Last week we looked at AI plan reviews that are being implemented, starting with single families. Like, this is coming, and people's tolerance for the nonsense will push, will push folks into privatization and AI. And we had a discussion about, like, City of Boston's looking at putting in, you do a call center to schedule inspections. And the discussion we were having is people are so used to everything they deal with. If I need a reservation for somewhere, I open an app and I might want it tomorrow and there might be no reservations, but then I look and then the next day, okay, you can have one at 5:15 or 7:45. That's all we have. But if you wait one more day, you can get one at 6. I go in the app, I click, and I get that reservation. Even the cable company, who absolutely sucks, I can at least call one person and they'll say, okay, we can have somebody out between this time and that time, and it's done, right? As building officials, we have to improve our level of service to survive, just to survive, because if not, we're going to be swallowed up by technology and political will. Like, nobody's willing to tolerate the inefficiency and waste that goes on in building departments, in fire departments, and health departments, and in housing departments. Like, so yeah, might hold on a little bit longer, but I'm telling you, we're watching pretty regularly, and we're seeing over here they're doing this, over there they're doing that, over here they implemented this. It's coming. And I think we're fools if we think, well, we've got a government job and we're just going to end up not getting touched.
I think you're 100% correct. We'd be absolute fools. I also think that for too long, people have viewed government services as a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And, I years ago, probably 20 years ago now, I was having a conversation. We were talking about service delivery in the fire department. And I, one of the folks, firefighters I was talking to, made a comment about, well, we need the public to know that we need these trucks and we need this and this is happening and this. I'm going, and I just asked the question, I go, they don't care. He goes, what do you mean they don't care? Of course they care. They need to know. I go, they don't care. Here's what they care about. They care about they're having a really bad day, something's going on and they need help. So all they care about is that when they dial the telephone, somebody answers it, and somebody shows up and their problem goes away. They don't care what it takes. They want it to be in a very short period of time. And as long as all those three things happen, they don't really care if you show up on a bicycle. They just don't. And that's again, putting ourselves in the position of the consumer. And I think a lot of times we forget that the public, from a governmental perspective, the public is our consumer, right? The industry is our consumer. And if we can put some business practice, and there's so much pushback to put business practice concepts into government operations that it just blows my mind, and it always has. I mean, I think about, and this is why I said earlier, I asked the question, why? Every time we're tasked with something new, I'm asking why. And the reason I'm asking why is because if we're just doing it because it's the new in vogue thing, mm-hmm. I've been around long enough to know that this stuff is cyclic. Mm-hmm. And, what's important now, I mean, let's face it, we were building stairs at 8:10, rise, run, long time ago. We went to 11:7, then now we're back to 8:10 in some area. Things are cyclic. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the values of having that level of longevity is understanding that things are cyclic and not getting all bound up and it must be a certain mm-hmm. way. But we don't think about what the needs are of the individual. Great example. I had a gentleman, I just hosted open town hall meetings in each ward in the city. And people go, well, why'd you do that? Because you asked, how do we change the dynamic? I think we change the dynamic by understanding our communities. We change the dynamic by giving people what they want of their service providers that they're paying, right? And so how would you know what they want if you don't ask them? How would you even have an opportunity to come close? One of the gentlemen in one of the meetings that I was in said to me, I don't do anything financial using an online format. I used to be able to show up and get a burning permit for my little fireplace I have in my backyard. And they'd write me out a piece of paper and I'd go on my merry way and we'd be all good. Now they tell me I can't do that anymore. I have to use the computer and I have to put in a credit card and give them a $5 fee. He goes, he's an elderly gentleman. He goes, I'm not doing that. There's got to be a way I can access the same level of service. And I'm like, I completely agree with you. But you think about how many times we do that. We set up these systems and we do it. I don't think it's malicious. I think we do it because we are doing it from the perspective of how do we make our jobs easier. And I think it's important for us to think about how do people access things. When I worked in a higher ed setting, one of the things I learned is you could send an email all day long to an 18, 19-year-old adult, and the probability they're going to read it in a timely fashion is somewhere between slim and never. Why? Because they don't communicate using that medium.
Mm-hmm.
So can I do that with a professor or the financial? Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
But I can't communicate with the student body that way.
Nope.
So understanding your audience and how to reach your audience is part of what we, in my opinion, fail miserably at, right? Which is why I keep bringing up, what does a plumber need? What does an electrician need? How do they do their jobs? How do we make it efficient? I want to walk into a job site or I want to walk into an inspection, and I don't want people there with their arms crossed, already set up for battle. I want to walk in and have a conversation. So my approach is very different, and people like kind of go, whoa, it's a conversation. How things going? Stop by, be personable, be fallible. Let them know I make mistakes every day. And I used to tell my kids, it's only 8 o'clock in the morning. I've already made about 60 mistakes. I'll guarantee I'll make another 60 to 100, right? Yeah. Don't worry about making mistakes. We all do.
We do that at dinner time too.
Yeah.
We say, what mistakes you make today. And the whole thing is to get everybody thinking that it's okay to make mistakes, and that's how you learn.
Yeah.
Right? Because we all get hung up on becoming fearful and not wanting to make mistakes and all that other stuff, and then you just can't grow. You can't grow unless you're making mistakes. So let's go to Keene.
Okay.
We talked about it already. Some interesting stuff around third party. If you choose to go third party plan review, 40% discount on your permit. If you choose to get an architect to design your single family home, what is it? A reduction?
There is a reduction in the fee. I want to say it's 10 or 15%. We have several different kind of incentive programs like that. So I don't want to say a specific number, but we give a percentage off of your permit fee.
Yep. And then your role, which is very unique, and I'll have in the intro so people will know for the beginning of the conversation, but you are both the fire marshal and the building official.
Yep.
Depending on what state you're listening from, the building official in this case might be called the building commissioner in other jurisdictions. Correct. But basically the head of the building department and the head of the fire department from a code perspective, right? There's still a fire chief, right? So that's unique. The reduction in fees is unique. The approach to customer service is clearly unique if you've been listening to this conversation for a while now. And then some just around the edges, some zoning stuff like Cottage Court overlay district where we're encouraging more density. That's exciting. What else am I missing? From a Keene perspective, what are you guys doing where you're trying to take that customer service piece and make it a reality?
So I've been there about 6 months. And when I went there, one of the things that on the fire side, every permit was done by paper. We put it into a system afterward, but it was in paper. And, one of the challenges is how do we're heavy in gas and oil permitting. So if you're a gas fitter, you want to install a boiler, you need a fire department permit, right? In New Hampshire, that's the way the structure is. And so what we were finding out is the industry doesn't function on a paper, right? So we went and was able to push our gas and oil permitting online. Our participation in that permitting process has shot through the roof. We've changed and kind of said, okay, well, we were having trouble where the vendors were upset because they were trying to get inspections, and it was, let's just say it was incomplete at best. They were not feeling good about the process. So we've shifted, right? You can apply for a permit at 3 a.m. and you will likely have that permit processed within a 24-hour period, unless it's a holiday or weekend. And it's not uncommon for me to be sitting there when I log in and see something just came in. On a Sunday, I'll go in and process the permit. Why are we doing that, right? Because it's not just the vendor. They're installing something for our constituents, the people we work for. And I used to despise when somebody says, I pay your salary. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to give them a nickel and say, there's your refund for the next 4 years, right? Because one individual doesn't really make that dent. And I've kind of shifted my thinking, because they do pay our salary. And although we don't have to do everything the way that they individually think, as a community, if that's what the community wants, that's what we're here for. And if we don't want to do what the community wants, we need to go find a new community. Mm-hmm. And I think people having that kind of perspective, instead of the perspective that they get to determine what the community wants, it's not my job as a building or fire official to tell the community how they want things to go. Mm-hmm. It's my job to understand them. And the only way I can understand them is by engaging them. So I've reached out to vendors. I've said, hey, here's what we want to do. If you've got an inspection, if you're going to do an install tomorrow and you find out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to be someplace at 8 tomorrow morning, no problem. We'll work with you, right? And if you tell me you think you're going to be done around noon, and I show up and you're 90%, you're not quite there, we'll figure it out, right? Instead of getting ourselves all tied up, right? So we're trying to meet the industry where it is, and not becoming an extra burden, because the more burdens that we create, the worse it's going to be. So you mentioned cottage core, you mentioned housing, right? Every place has an issue right now with enough housing, affordable housing, sizes of housing. And a lot of our land development regulations in the past have focused on preventing too much density, or creating a certain look and feel in certain neighborhoods, right? That's what zoning's about, mm-hmm. right? And planning out the community in a certain way. And so one of the things we realized is that, sometimes if you've got not a lot of land to develop already, how do you tackle that housing issue, for example? And one of the things the city's done, they've done several creative things, but one of the things they've done creative is this idea of cottage court. So you could actually take, and we used to do cluster housing and those kinds of things back in the day. You still need the same amount of land, right? But you put a whole bunch of land over here, and then you could put the houses close together. You wouldn't need the same setbacks. What cottage court essentially does is we essentially get away from a lot of those kind of structural setbacks. Setbacks are a good example, mm-hmm. right?
Or even I saw no minimum lot requirement.
No minimum lot requirement, exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have a project right now. There was a small lot in the city. They're building 3. They're not really a tiny home, but they're in the neighborhood of 600-700 square feet. Right. So they're in the neighborhood. That is where we are. People are looking for right now.
Yeah.
Those are what's affordable. People are not going to be able to give the $600,000-$800,000 realm. They're going to need to be down in the 400 or less, and they want less space. Mm-hmm. So when you think of that, how do we as a community respond to that? And cottage court's a great example where you don't need minimum lot requirements. You might not need the same setback rules, right? Mm-hmm. There are lots of things going on in New Hampshire right now. They just passed a piece of legislation, and it was reinforced in the building code, that you can take and even with a change of use, you can go up to 4 units in a residential setting, as long as each unit meets a series of requirements. And one of the primary ones is it has to have its own direct access to the outside exit. You can do that and not sprinkler the building. And so when you think about how do we reduce the cost of development, mm-hmm. right? Lot size is a great example of, right? That's a big deal. Huge. How do you, if you reduce setback requirements, if you increase, a little bit of density, if you reduce pervious soil, right? All these things play into how do we develop.
Yeah, and I like that the approach, and like that was a huge reason, because I was like, when you were telling me this stuff, the idea of a city taking this approach and actually executing on it, and I understand that it's not going to be perfect. That's why I had Providence on to talk, because, you know, they weren't admitting that anything was perfect, but they were saying, you want to do something in Providence, here's our phone number. We will sit down with the planning department, the building department, the fire department. Let's talk about it.
Amen.
I can't tell you that you're always going to get the answer that you want, but you'll get an answer. Like, and there's probably 10,000 things wrong in Providence as well, but like there's an effort there that's happening. And I look at Keene and like, you know, like the whole thing they say, how do you eat the elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can't fix everything, but you help make things more economical on the permitting side. How many times people have run into frustration where one answer from the building department, a different answer from the fire department, and they're, you know, the exasperation from the constituent or the end user is so maddening, right? And you get caught in this, you know, rat race going back and forth between departments and say, listen, you're both the fucking same city. Like, put your heads together, talk, and give us an answer, right? Like, this is crazy that we have to do this kind of stuff. So the idea of Keene kind of removing that barrier, and I'm sure there's some negatives to having one person overseeing building and fire from the permitting perspective or the code perspective, as you said it. But it's a step. And then, okay, let's do cottage court. Let's see what's happening in the state. Like, so we're bringing down costs, we're reducing friction, we're online permitting for fuel permits. Like, that's great, right? Like, you've now had, as you said earlier in the conversation, voluntary compliance by people, right? How much effort? Like, you could run around trying to do enforcement and chasing people and looking for, you know, vans, HVAC vans, and try and do gotcha on people. And you could do that with an army of friggin' 20 people, and you probably wouldn't get the compliance you did just by putting that thing online, right?
And communicating it, right? So this is the other thing. I think that the other thing that we fail to do well is engagement. We think engagement is pushing in one direction a message.
Mm-hmm.
Engagement's a conversation. And I think that is very scary to many folks in the governmental world, because they fear giving the rabble-rousers, some of them, right? Mm-hmm. Too much ability to influence. I view it a little bit differently. I think by engaging our community, we end up with less pushback. We end up with more support because the community feels like we're carrying out their wishes. Right, and we're going to have the fringes on both sides.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking
And you're
about.
never going to please them.
We're never going to. I could hand some people a bag of gold and they'll tell me it's too heavy.
Yeah.
Right. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, as a group, being responsive to the community. Keene's very unique. Keene's an old small city.
Yeah,
right?
I love it.
It's you know, the building age is like 73% of our building stock is pre-1970. It's an old city.
Yeah.
We have the same problems that other cities have as far as housing stock that has been converted and modified over the years with and without proper oversight. We have the same challenges that other jurisdictions have had as far as documenting. I chuckled. We had a property that had 7 units, and we found some information back in 1973, I think it was, that they knew what units. Now, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then we look and we see how many permits got issued for various work that wasn't in the view of the context of number of units. Mm. And now we have a situation where we have a 7-unit building that's supposed to be a 3-unit building.
Yeah.
Right? But we also have a situation where, we've issued some permits along the way that kind of tacitly didn't approve it, but it kind of, we didn't dig deep enough, or we didn't think about it. What these things that we just talked about, cottage court's a great example. It provides a pathway for us to bring those into compliance.
Yeah, framework.
Right?
Okay.
It gives us a framework to kind of conceptualize, how can we get there? It's an unconventional thing. Once it's already there, it's very unconventional to think about how can we legitimize it from a land use perspective. Cottage court's a land use regulation, because I can't get it to the safety standards I need if I'm violating the land use. So I can't say, Joe, you've got this problem with your building, go fix it. You go, well, give me a permit, I'll go fix it. Well, I can't give you a permit because you got too many units, you got to square that away. So we get in this vicious cycle. So we've created a good example. We have a meeting once a week with these complex code cases. And all of the inspectional services staff, including the fire department inspectors, are in the room, and we have a conversation about what are the challenges with each case. We unify our strategy on how we're going to approach each case. We assign a person who has the lead for this particular project, try to get more like a project management aspect. And then we actually engage with the property owner. And we've had property owners or their representatives come in. We've walked through what the challenges are, what the scenarios or possibilities are for them to explore. Great example, we have a lot of area in the floodplain, right? So can't issue a permit to you if you're not meeting the floodplain regulations, because we are a FEMA CRS community, right? So when you think about that, there's a lot of little things to work through. And I think that's what we forget, is that there's so many competing interests, even on the governmental side, that the consumer looks at that and it looks like an impossible hill to climb. And if we could try to unify things, you mentioned, me having the oversight. I think that's really what we're trying to do, is get it so that when people are trying to look at how do I do this, they're not looking at Mount Monadnock, or they're not looking at Mount Washington, right? They're looking at, okay, if I take this trail, it's a little less steep than if I take this trail.
Yeah, and can I get to the first landing spot or whatever, right? Let's go there. Let's not go to the top of the mountain. Let's get up to the first spot.
Yep.
And for people that are thinking like, oh, that's, for a little city up in New Hampshire, that's doable, but where we live, there's all these complexities. For people that don't know, you've got a major university in the town, Keene State, or what do they go? Keene State University now. Yep. So you have an influx of college students. We all know what goes with college students. If people have if probably pretty heavy Boston listener base here, like you go to Brighton or Alston, you're dealing with that, right? Where there's a housing shortage and you have seasonal people coming in and out. It's driving up the cost of housing. You have a younger population that's probably doing stupid things in these houses, and all the health issues that come with that, and trash, and they're doing this in a complex environment in Keene. So to say in our small city in Massachusetts, or our big suburban town in Massachusetts, we couldn't do that. Some suburban town in Massachusetts, even if it's a decent size, has nowhere near the complexity of what Keene is dealing with. So it's doable. It just takes the right attitude. And again, we've talked about it, and I'm going to say it, you're not claiming everything's perfect.
Oh, gosh, no.
There's all kinds of problems. But you're taking some action, and you're getting some results. Keene's getting some results. And I really enjoy, you look at the website, and I see the woman Mari, who's the planner, and she's on there with videos explaining what's happening, and there's a fair amount of transparency. And again, not perfect, but there's action, and they're taking steps. And if back to that, making mistakes, let's say cottage court doesn't work, the impression I get is, okay, well, let's tact and let's find something that does work, right? We're taking, you're taking bites at the apple, you're taking shots, whatever the right word is. And I think that's exciting. I think that's the people that, I'm going to use the word I right now a lot. I want to get out in front of listeners and watchers, just like other communities that I see that are doing the right thing. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about to code officials like you, who are saying we should be asking why, right? That's unheard of from code enforcement people, right? It's our job is public safety, whether it's fire a building, and this mindset of, even the idea of talking about money, the amount of people that I see money isn't our concern here. It's public safety.
I always laugh.
That's just a stupid statement, right? Like, oh, okay, yeah, but if the person can't afford it and you're going to put them out of their home, do you think they really give a shit about a fucking smoke detector if they don't have a place to live? So, like, yeah, we have to think about money. Let's not be foolish here, right? So these are the conversations I want to have. I want to spotlight people like yourself. I want to spotlight cities like Keene that are going out and doing it. And kudos to you guys. I think that's great. And my hope here is that this conversation, even if it's clipped up and shared in little pieces or whatever, helps get it out there and keeps driving this change. And to the code officials listening, sorry, I'm on my soapbox here for a little bit, right? Man. You know, for the code officials listening, like, the change is coming. And if we're not going to get on board and address it ourselves and make the changes ourselves and start doing good customer service and start accepting technology and being flexible, right? I think we're just cutting our own throats.
Right? I couldn't agree more, Joe. So, if we don't pick up the pen, so to speak, and start writing the story and being the editor of the story, the folks in the legislature are going to do it for us because the consumers are going to want that, right? You asked a simple question, right? What can we do?
Yep.
And I'm just going to give a couple of quick bullets, right? Yep. First of all, focus on servicing the community, right? What do I mean? What are the public's expectations versus our organizational expectations? Understand that. Mm-hmm. How can you get that information? You have to ask. You have to go out and find out. Be proactive, not reactive. We're not sitting on the butts waiting for somebody to call. If you submitted a permit application, we gave you a plan review comments back. If we don't hear from you in a couple of weeks, we're calling you.
Yeah, that's
right. We're not letting it sit there for a year, right? That's silly, right? Engage. Be a public servant, not a public employee. Be a public servant. And then lastly, with the why, document the process, the business process. Map it out. Say these are the steps. And at each step, evaluate the why. Because if you do that, you will find that you can eliminate certain steps because they don't service what you're trying to accomplish. And lastly, none of this works if you do not engage all of the stakeholder groups. You have to regularly engage and adjust your process and review and revise your process. I told you, I just held 5 ward meetings, right? Open meetings. Anybody could come. I'm going to give you the big themes. The big themes are people generally don't trust government, right? And that they want to have a voice. They just want to be heard. And I think if we take that into consideration as we start to retool our departments, we're going to be closer to what the public wants, right? That's the goal. We take our expectations from an organizational perspective and we match those up with the public's expectations, and guess what? Now we have a process that everybody's willing to play in. And that's really, I think that to me, I don't know if it's going to work, but I know we're going to do something and we're going to keep the ball moving.
Yeah. So we'll end with that. One thing I want to add is, or comment, I should say, on, is the second to last thing you said, I think is very important, which is you were basically saying, like, why? Like, look at that process and decide, why are we doing this? I think the biggest problem that government as a whole has, and this is on a small scale happens at a building department, is the process continues to get added to and lengthen. Well, now we need this affidavit, and I want this form, and now we need this, and we add and we add and we add, and we make it more difficult and more difficult and more difficult. When was the last time you eliminated something in your building department? Because we don't really need that anymore. Probably never.
Well, I can tell you my answer. We've eliminated stuff.
Right. And that's great. And I think that's a huge thing. Where can we make this easier? No, we don't need that anymore. Like my favorite is we need a copy of your license front and back in Massachusetts, right? It's at some departments, they say we want a copy of it front and back. There's nothing on the back that delineates anything from that. And also you can put your number there and it's online. Look it up and you can see if it's like, this what are we doing that for? But that's the way it's just always been happening. So and that's a minor thing, right? But it's just stuff that just keeps getting added and added and added, and it just grows and it grows and it grows, and it never goes away. But to your point, like, why? Why are we asking for this? Oh, because in 1985, the only thing we had was a hard card to look at, and there wasn't even the internet. Okay, maybe we don't need that anymore, right?
We had the internet in '85. I just want you to.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
It wasn't great, but
you know
we
what
had it.
Yes, it existed a long time ago, but not for general public. Yes.
You bring up a good point, right? Some organizations will take that very thing. You didn't give us a copy of something that is available to validate online. And think about from a business process perspective. A human being now has to write something to reject your application, send it to you, let multiple days go by because we send it via snail mail. Then you get it. Then you get a little bit enraged, and then you figure out how you're going to get it. By the time we get it back, we've wasted enormous amounts of time and resource. One of the things I've said to my staff is, look, if somebody doesn't have their gas fitter license on them, right, look it up. Ask them if they've got an ID so you can just validate who they are. I'm good with that.
Yeah.
But I don't need copies of that. Look it up.
Keep it moving.
Because literally, it'll take me 3 minutes to look it up, be done, get you what you need, instead of play this back and forth game. Yeah. Right? And that comes from the service culture. And I think that's the most important thing that I'm trying to get across is we need to recognize the why. Why are we here? Why is code officials a thing? And it's a thing because we're here to provide service. And if we think like that and all we do, and we look to make it as easy and as pleasurable from a service perspective as we can for the consumer, we win.
It's going to be a win. Yep. Excellent. I'm into there. Rick, thanks for coming down. Thanks for looking at things the way you do. It's needed for us as building officials. It's needed for the constituents. It's great that you're doing that. It's great that Keene's doing what they're doing. And I appreciate you taking this time. It's awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks, sir.